Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Our next presenter is William Brower, who will be is joining us here from the Department of Chemistry at Penn State University, and we'll be presenting on knowledge discovery using data mined from nuclear magnetic resonance spectral images.
Thanks, Lee. I apologize. This is very orthogonal to everything that's come up so far, so bear with me. This will be brutal. I work for Carl Mueller in chemistry, and in conjunction with Lee Giles and Prasenjit Mitra in IST, whom you may be more familiar with. My training is in physics, actually, and what I'm trying to do here is a very specific application of cyber infrastructure. I'm trying to do something very practical with cyber infrastructure. We have great recourse to data, and I'm doing something with it in terms of NMR spectral image. And what I'd like to talk about today is doing structure determination, taking these NMR spectral images and converting them back into the structure that they pertain to. So this is sort of an inverse problem. I'd also like to sort of allude to the fact that we're invoking and building cyber infrastructure by doing this. I'll have to, unfortunately, go over some of the methods we use. These include solid-state ab initio calculations, as well as the experimental technique of NMR, and try and demonstrate how we can use machine learning in the form of support vector machines to support this process of interpretation. And obviously I'll give you a little glimpse at the results that we're having at this stage and look at some of the current and future work. So what motivates us? Well, we have this great powerful tool, this local probe, which looks at the angstrom and nanoscale of materials. It can reveal things like bond angles and lengths and chemical identity. But in the solid state, we have the pernicious influence of broadening mechanisms and sort of interactions which can complicate interpretation. So interpretation in solid-state physics and chemistry always is supported by some form of approximate calculation or ab initio or first principles calculation, as well as the need to simulate this spectra. So to go from our spectra to a model is a lot of compute-intensive steps. So to put it in a nutshell, we'd like to replace some of those compute-intensive steps using the data that we have from our cyber infrastructure that we also contribute to greatly increase this process of going from spectra to structure. So this is a good plug at this point for the cyber infrastructure that we've been working on at Penn State. I want to say it's alpha. I'm not really sure what stage it's at, but it is the traditional model. We have at the client side a web portal which gives users recourse to both the data that they have from an instrument as well as from calculations. But also, and this is mostly due to Giles' work, we have a document repository which is growing. And this repository is a wealth of information that we've written algorithms to mine. So we have data in the form of spectra from spectrometers, and we have data in the form of spectral images. I think in the position paper I allude to the fact that we use the images from documents. We don't actually have that many documents yet. I believe we're dealing with a publisher right now to get more of that sort of data. So today I'll primarily be using user data as well as ab initio data. So the method that we approach here is obviously to both add to this collaboratory and take from the collaboratory in the sense that we want to replace those intermediate steps by performing machine learning. We want to go directly from an NMR spectra to a structure without having to do all these compute-intensive things. So we have to inject some sort of intelligence as to how to go about this process. It sounds like we're promising the world. It's a very grandiose idea. We, in the solid state, I should say, have some idea generally of the underlying structure. This is not like liquid state NMR or protein sort of sequencing. In liquid state NMR, we have the advantage of almost a direct mapping between things like shifts in a spectrum and bond lengths. Solid state NMR, not so much, but we generally do have some idea of what the structure is like. So we tend to invoke first principle calculations. Ab initio refers to that fact, so this is a calculation from quantum mechanical principles. We employ a number of approximations. There are essentially two communities, those that look at molecules and those that look at crystalline systems. I know that's a very coarse breakdown, and I'll be chastised for it. But if you look at a solid-state system, you're concerned with periodicity, and you tend to expand this equation in terms of plane waves, which is very costly. So one also uses pseudopotentials for the core regions, which are mostly inert. The chemically active orbitals are the valence orbitals. These are expanded in plane waves. We use a number of approximations. Some of these you may be familiar with. For instance, we approximate the exchange and correlation between electrons. We also take this many-body equation, and in the Kohn-Sham formalism, we reduce it to an equation in terms of single electron wave functions. But the bottom line of this approach is essentially to calculate something we can measure. I know a theorist will disagree, but we want to couple this with experiment very succinctly. So the reason for doing this is to get an expectation value of something we can measure. So to use the example of Forsterite, this is a mineral of interest to chemists like Carl at Penn State. We think about the atoms that are in that system, and then we go ahead and pseudize the cores of those things, and we decide what's going to be bonding. So we pick our valence orbitals, and we treat these with a formalism that sort of bridges the pseudo waves of the core with the plane waves of the valence. This is the projector augmented formalism. Then we go ahead and relax the structure. We minimize the forces. So at this stage, hopefully you're getting an appreciation for the computational intensity that we employ here. This, again, is something that we would like to replace. So we end up with a wave function that we can use to calculate an expectation value. And this is something that we can measure indirectly in NMR through the quadrupole coupling constant and asymmetry parameter, which is pertinent to systems that have spin greater than a half, a nuclear spin greater than a half. So this is sort of a natural lead-in then, of course, to a little bit of theory on solid-state NMR. This is a magnetic effect which relies upon nuclear spin. When these nuclear spin are embedded in a static magnetic field, they precess at the Larmor frequency. And we are going to exploit that by pulsing the systems with radio frequency energy, which is generally close to the Larmor frequency, and we measure the system response. That's a very simplified explanation, but it's much like hitting a bell with a hammer, and we listen to the sound. These frequencies do range actually from the audio right up to the megahertz. But to make some sense of our free induction decay of the time series that we acquire, we transform this and we look in the Fourier domain for shifts away from the Larmor frequency, which are actually functions of interactions that give us the structural information. This is sort of a first-year overview of these interactions, the sort of relative magnitudes. That rather avant-garde diagram on the right-hand side shows that the quadrupole line shape is very broad and indistinct. As I say, quadrupole nuclei have a spin greater than half, which means their quadrupole moment can interact with an electric field gradient. And this is a tensor interaction which is dependent on orientation. So in polycrystalline solids, which is what we deal with most of the time, this introduces anisotropic broadening. This is both good and bad. It's good from the perspective that we have additional structural information in that shape. It's bad in the sense that it promotes overlap between different chemical species, and we also need to simulate this thing to get out this very sensitive information. There are mitigating techniques such as MAS, magic angle spinning, which basically spins at a specific angle to eliminate one part of that tensor interaction. So we can reduce this quadrupole broadening, but we have second-order effects which remain. So this motivates a higher resolution experiment called MQMAS, multiple quantum magic angle spinning. This is a two-dimensional technique which has become very popular in the last few years. We have these frequencies that are a function of two isotropic shifts and also an anisotropic or broadening term which is dependent on the orientation of these crystallites. You can see that second-order quadrupole shift is a direct function of CQ and eta, which is the quantities that we calculate with ab initio with some sort of structural model in mind. So in MQMAS, from an information theoretic perspective, we have this frequency equation, which is a function of three unknowns, if you like. If we introduce a second frequency dimension, it becomes a different function of three unknowns. Therefore, with the added information, we can eliminate at least one of those terms. And obviously, we would like to eliminate that anisotropy. and more often than not, this is what we do. So to again use the example of Forsterite, this is an example of an empty mass spectrum where we've pulsed on magnesium. We've hit it at close to the Larmor frequency of magnesium. But we introduce a second frequency domain by introducing at least one more pulse and stepping the interpulse delay. So instead of Fourier transforming a vector of data points, we transform a matrix of data points to give us 2 dimensions. And in so doing, we can resolve the chemically different magnesium sites in Forsterite. This is a contour plot of the spectrum, and you can see from the different shapes that these magnesium are in different environments. So that's a very crude and quick overview of the theory that we invoke and the experimental technique that we use. So obviously what we'd like to do is remove these compute-intensive steps. We have to simulate the MQ mass to get out these parameters that we then compare with ab initio that we performed on the basis of our understanding of the model. So there is a great potential using the data that we have and are continuing to gather with ChemXia to do this. As I think I mentioned in the position paper in which I've moved away from, we will have that data in the form of images from journal documents, and there is an easy mapping from pixels back to intensity because contours don't overlap. So we can simply use the connected components labeling to do that mapping back. But for the purposes of this work, we've simply been using simulations that we perform using software we've written. So then one needs to come up with a set of features to do said machine learning, and there is an easy way of picking out this intensity data. We can use the isotropic projection to succinctly locate those regions that correspond to the maxima in the isotropic dimensions. So we cut this thing up. Then we have intensity information represented there as matrix A, and this can be quite a number of intensity or frequency points, usually of the order of tens of thousands. So I've just used this simple technique to reduce the dimensionality by using the Hessian of that matrix. The Hessian is a useful quantity because it's translationally invariant. It doesn't matter where that frequency data is in the data window. And then we calculate the eigenvalue spectrum, which is scaled by the relative intensity. And in this manner, we come up with a position and intensity invariant set to use for training. So this is just a quick overview of that whole process in a nutshell. We use the isotropic projection to snip this thing up. When we have the individual chemical sites, we compute the Hessian, which has sort of translated there. And then we calculate the eigenspectrum, which is scaled by the intensities. You can see that those two spectrums, while similar in shape, have very different magnitudes. So at least to the human eye at this stage, you can see that we have good separation between these two inequivalent sites. So this brings me to the type of ML that we've employed. I apologize for any abuses of notation, but we essentially have two good techniques to decide between. There's the well-established neural nets, back-propagating neural nets, and then we can use SVMs. We went with SVMs not because we know a great deal about it coming from a different field, but because these scale well with the data sizes that we use, and they're also relatively easy to train and to work with. The learning rules aren't as finicky as with neural nets, and they are, as I say, very easy to work with. So we have this regression function, this linear function, and we have the data mapped to a higher dimensional space using the nonlinear function psi, and using a special cost function, we optimize the weights and the constants b. So to summarize thus far, then, we have these features that we extract from the NMR spectra using the method outlined, and these features we then go and take as our inputs, and the outputs are obviously the structure that correspond to that NMR spectra. The training data is the features extracted from NMR spectra, and the outputs are the structure that come from ab initio calculations. So the progression is we have a structure in mind. We do the ab initio to calculate the parameters we measure with NMR, and then we simulate the spectra using those parameters. So the features are the parameters. Well, the features come from the NMR spectra, and they're then correlated with the structure that generated that spectra. So the input features are the spectral parameters, and the output is the structure that it pertains to. We can talk offline. So this is a mashup of how we use the SVMs to achieve this machine learning task. At this stage, we've been assigning a single SVM to each position component. So we have, as I said, the structural model in mind, and we then do the ab initio to calculate CQ and eta, which we then use to simulate the NMR spectra. So for each atomic position component, we assign a single SVM. So for Forsterite, that's 18 SVMs, but we have information from 2 magnesium sites in the MQ-mass spectra. So we have 2 grids of SVM ensembles that we simply weight by using the training accuracy, which is one method in the literature for doing this. So the input for each grid element are 50 eigenvalue features, and the output is a 1 atomic position component. So just a quick summary of some of the results that we have. This again is just dealing with Forsterite. So this is sort of a morphology study. We're stressing the structure by introducing random displacements up to 5% away from the positions. We then do the ab initio using Espresso, which comes out of Italy, and then we use custom software that we've written to simulate the spectra on the basis of CQ and eta, these quadrupole parameters that we calculate. And we use SVM Lite for creating the ensemble. And at this stage, when we present a trial structure to the system, we can reproduce the spectra to within about 10%. And the simple way to increase the accuracy is just to do better ab initio. We've been doing very abbreviated runs, and we also need a much larger training set. So currently, we're obviously doing that, trying to improve the accuracy, but this is strictly sort of a morphology application. We want to extend this to doing studies of uptake of heavy elements in minerals. This is something of interest to Carl's group at Penn State. So we want to learn where these heavy elements substitute into things like zeolites and clays, and to what percentage they substitute. This is of relevance out at the Hanford Waste Site in Washington. And something of interest more to me is in disordered materials, things that are glassy. They have horrible NMR spectra, horrible XRD, and so there's still a lot of active research in understanding local structure in disordered systems. So I'm sorry, I really whipped through that. I was pitching for 20 minutes, but at any rate, we have this solid state NMR, this great local probe of atomic structure. It's impeded by the need to simulate and also do calculations to back out an interpretation. So we have this advantage of the ChemXC Collaboratory at Penn State, which is a wealth of data that we can use to do machine learning to replace some of those compute-intensive steps. And we have some good results at this point that we intend to extend to other applications. I would, of course, like to thank Microsoft for the opportunity to be here, and also NSF for funding the work. Any questions? Yeah. So, are you working in fractional coordinates or Cartesian, and how do you deal with displacement of axes, monoclinic angles, and phase? We've been using just the Cartesian coordinates, and I'll worry about how that affects symmetry later. So we start with absolute coordinates in angstroms, and then presumably after we've done the displacements, we'll work out space groups later. But you're exactly right. We need to know how, the symmetry changes under stresses and strains. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Sure. If you whisper that into Lee Giles' ear, I think that'd be great, because we need, many hands make light work, and that would certainly help me.
Well, if there's no further questions, I'd like to thank William and all of the speakers for a very nice session. And we can go on to lunch and poster sessions. So thank you all very much.